Many people think that there is a conflict between science and the Christian faith, and unfortunately this includes young people who attend colleges and universities. And for those young people, that perceived conflict can create a lot of confusion, maybe even despair in some instances. And so we really need to make sure that we know how to properly address the concerns that young people have. And Dr. Carlson, you're a biochemist and a Christian, and you have a lot of experience teaching at the university level. In fact, when you were a professor of biochemistry and molecular biology at the University of Georgia, you identified yourself routinely to your class, to your biochemistry class, as a Christian. And you've told me that part of the reason is just to hopefully encourage students afterwards to maybe ask you some important questions about Christianity, but also about how Christianity fits with science. And you went one step further. You and your wife, Cheryl, even invited students to your home to have dinner and to discuss these issues. And so you've got a lot of experience working with young people in this capacity. And so my first question is, what types of questions, what types of concerns do college students have about science faith issues? Christians, but also even non-Christians as well.
Yes. Well, when I first extended that invitation, I had some students come and ask, and I think they were some of them were Christians or came from a Christian background, and the common concern that they voiced was, well, what should I think about evolution as a Christian? Can I be a scientist and a Christian at the same time? And some of them voiced the concern that they thought that science and Christianity were completely opposed to one another, and so on. And so Cheryl and I wanted to invite students over to our home to give them the opportunity to discuss these kinds of concerns in more detail. And so, that was the main institution. That's the main concerns that they had.
And so what did you tell them to help resolve some of these concerns that they had?
Well, I think one of the things that many of the students are unaware of is the role that Christianity played in history and to the development of what we call modern science. Is that many of the early scientists were all men of faith, people like Robert Boyle and James Clerk Maxwell and Louis Pasteur and Kepler and Copernicus, and they were all men of faith, and that Christianity had certain teachings and qualities that allowed science to develop. And one of them, for sure, was that because the universe was created by God, it was intelligible, and that we being made in His image could understand it and comprehend it and investigate it. And that was one thing. The other thing was that Christianity taught it was a good thing to do, to study nature. That it was wonderful to understand, good to understand, and that scientific investigation could be of benefit to mankind. That is, we could carry out the Christian command for compassion and so on in a very practical way through scientific discovery and so on. And that the other thing was, of course, is that students were, one of the reasons for the doubt is the idea that evolution can be a substitute for God, and I wanted to discuss this further with them because that's, in my view, not really necessarily the case, and also not the view of a lot of other scientists too, that this is not necessarily the case, and that actually it's a better explanation, that scientific discovery fits better with the idea that God does exist, and that a lot of things that we can see can be better explained by His existence. I think that one of the arguments that's given is that we have to fit all of science into a certain explanation, and that is called a natural explanation, okay, that everything has to be explained naturally. And so what I think is a better way is to look at scientific discovery and look for what we think is the best explanation, the true explanation. The true explanation may not necessarily be confined to a box that just requires us to think that it's a natural explanation, especially when it has, discovery has metaphysical implications and theological implications.
Now, both you and I are, sympathetic to the idea of intelligent design. Both you and I have some measure of skepticism towards aspects of the evolutionary paradigm. But what would you say to a student that just can't get past what they believe to be compelling evidence for evolution? What would you say to a student that just says, again, I'm absolutely convinced evolution is true. Do I have to reject the faith?
Well, I don't. I would say that it depends on what he means by evolution, I suppose. But you mean in terms of that evolution, mutation and natural selection accounted for speciation and
Yes.
and the diversity in life and so on. Well, there are people that believe that who still are Christians, okay, and they're called theistic evolutionists. And while I don't agree with them in terms of the power of natural selection or random mutation and natural selection, that it can have that kind of creative power, they posit that in their belief in God as Christians, that God basically, if you will, front-loaded everything with so that nature developed the way it does through mutation and natural selection. But that God was there at the beginning of that whole process, At least that's my understanding of it. So there are many people that kind of accept the standard evolutionary ideas, and it's still are believers that God was involved at the beginning. There's an organization called Biologos that's an organization that's has that position, but I would strongly still encourage them to really look in detail at the evidence, how strong the evidence is for that, to be objective about it. I would also encourage them to think about nature in terms of the Scripture as being God's spoken word, and we have God's the Scripture as God's inspired written word. And to consider the possibility that sometimes there might be a mistake in science, or that further science will change and refine some of these ideas from the scientific perspective, and also that perhaps there are other interpretations. Sometimes our interpretations of Scripture are fallible as well, and we can make mistakes in that. Theologically, we have churches with many different interpretations of Scripture. Probably not all of them, some are right and some are wrong. We have disagreements about theology, and so there can be different ways of looking at some things in Scripture as well. But there's no reason, inherent reason, to give up the Christian faith in order to pursue science, even if you strongly think that it supports the standard evolutionary mechanism. I just would encourage them to be open-minded, to really objectively consider the evidence that they're looking at, and when it points perhaps to a different direction, be willing to consider that.